Hello everyone, I'm Louise. I work for Tutor Impact. You might have seen some of my other videos that I've done talking about things like idioms or maybe my life in Spain. But today I'm here to talk to you about William Shakespeare. So I'm not sure. I hope that you will have heard of Shakespeare before. Don't worry if not, you're going to know lots and lots about him after the next half an hour, if not. But he's a very, very famous English man, so you may well know about him. So I'm just going to share my PowerPoint with you and then we can get started. Right, let's see. So, this is an introduction to William Shakespeare, and here he is on the right. In the time that Shakespeare lived, which we're going to learn about when that was, there weren't cameras. So the only pictures that we have of him are drawings or paintings, but we're pretty sure we think this is what he looked like because the paintings are contemporary. What I mean by contemporary is that they were drawn at the time that he was alive. So this was someone who actually had William Shakespeare sat in front of them and they drew a picture of him. So this is how he looked. So yeah, he was known for dressing quite well as well. But how he looks obviously isn't the most important thing about him. What's important about Shakespeare is what he did. So who was William Shakespeare? Well, he's a very renowned English writer, probably the most famous writer in the whole world, or at least in the European world, the most famous writer. He was a poet, he wrote poems, a playwright, so he wrote plays, and he was an actor as well, so he liked to act in his own plays. And he was the most famous and influential author in the whole of English literature, definitely. Shakespeare was alive about 400 years ago, but why are we still talking about him now? Why am I giving you a 30-minute lesson on Shakespeare 400 years after he died? Well, we're going to find out because he lived a life which his life wasn't the most exciting life, but he produced work that we still are reading, learning about today because it's so exciting. It's about interesting characters, and it's so interesting that the things that he spoke about 400 years ago and that interested audiences 400 years ago still are interesting now. So it's interesting to learn that life 400 years ago maybe wasn't so different as it was now. They wore different clothes, they spoke a little bit differently, but the things that they were worried about, the things that they found funny, the way that they loved each other, the way that they argued, is the same as how we are now. So that's one of the things that I find most interesting about Shakespeare's work is the way that it's still so relevant. It was written so long ago, but we can still read it and figure out what it says and then still think, wow, that's quite funny. Or wow, that's quite relatable. That happened to me last week. You know, it's really interesting how it's stayed relevant for 400 years and probably still will be read in another 400 years. Definitely in our lifetimes anyway. So, Shakespeare. He was born on the 23rd of April, 1564, in Stratford upon Avon. 1564, so it's nearly 500 years now, more like 450 years, so a long, long time ago. And Stratford upon Avon is a place in England, not so far from London, and we'll see later that Shakespeare lived a lot of his life in London as well. But he was born in Stratford upon Avon. He died in 1616 at the age of 52. So born 1564, died 1616. And what's interesting is we can't be sure, but we think that Shakespeare died on his birthday. How rubbish. So we know that he was buried on the 25th of April. And what normally happened in those times is when you died, there was 2 days where your body was left for people to come and pay their respects. So if he died on the 25th, that means, if he was buried on the 25th, that means he probably died 2 days before, so the 23rd of April, which was his birthday. At the time that he was alive, William Shakespeare he became quite famous within England. Most people, especially from kind of the upper circles of society, richer people, people who went to the theatre lots, would know who he was. Especially because, as we will see, he was very popular with some queens and kings of England. They really liked him. So he became quite well known, but his worldwide fame came mostly after his death, after scholars. Scholars are people who work on academic work, so things like books, science. They're kind of teachers, but people who research the things to teach. So it was when scholars from England started sharing his work all around the world that he became more and more famous worldwide. And that's why we're still talking about him. And that's why I'm talking about him to you today. So we're going to next find out a little bit about Shakespeare's family life. So again, we've got a picture here, which is not a photograph because there was no cameras, but it's a drawing of Shakespeare and his family. And we're going to look more about who was involved. So his parents, it's difficult to find a good picture of them because again, they're all drawn, but here they are. His parents were John Shakespeare and Mary Arden. Together, John Shakespeare and Mary Arden had 8 children. Can you imagine? In those days, it was much more common to have lots and lots of children because families would need their children to help on the farm, or they would want their children to just help in general working. So for various different reasons, people had more children in those days. Another reason people had more children is that sadly, because medicine and doctors weren't as widely available, children often died younger. So actually, the 2 eldest children of John Shakespeare and Mary Arden did die very young. So William's 2 elder sisters died young, and then William became the eldest. John Shakespeare was a glove maker by trade. He made gloves. That was how he earned money to support his family. But importantly for William's life, John Shakespeare also played a big part in the politics of Stratford-upon-Avon, the place where they lived. So John became involved in helping out the local government, in doing things for the town. And because of that, he earned some more money and gained more respect within Stratford-upon-Avon. That allowed, we think, we can't be sure because there isn't lots of evidence, but we think that allowed William to attend the local grammar school. And grammar schools are schools which are supposed to give a very high level of teaching. When he was there, Shakespeare probably learned things like Latin, Greek, history, and then he probably left school, we think, when he was 14 or 15. That was the normal age to leave school. But it seems like because of his dad's position in society, he will have had a good education, which will have helped him later in his life writing his plays, his sonnets. Okay, later in Shakespeare's life, he married a lady called Anne Hathaway. They married when Shakespeare was only 18 and Anne was 26. So Anne was quite a bit older than Shakespeare when they married. So it was quite young to get married for Shakespeare, but then in those days as well, people did get married a lot younger. People would get married at kind of age 13, 14 even. For example, in one of Shakespeare's plays, Juliet, one of the main characters, is only 13 and she gets married, and her parents are actually looking for her to get married at that age. So it wasn't unusual for people to be married earlier than that. So Anne and William had 3 children together. Their first child was called Susanna. Their second 2 were twins. They were called Hamnet and Judith. So Judith and Susanna were girls. Hamnet was a boy. Sadly, Hamnet died when he was only 11. So again, it's a case of because medicine wasn't as good, children died when they were younger, and often there just wasn't anything that they could do about it. An important thing about this is that in the time when Shakespeare was alive, when someone died, they would pass most of their property normally to their eldest son. It was males who inherited property. So when Shakespeare's eldest only son died, he didn't have any other choice but to leave his property when he died to his daughters. But that wasn't usual of the time. It was more usual to leave it to your son. So, more recent evidence showed, so when he married Anne Hathaway, he was still in Stratford-upon-Avon. We think recent evidence has shown that he stayed living in Stratford-upon-Avon for a lot of his life. Even when he was older, he was still spending a lot of time there, even whilst he was working in London. Nowadays, that's not so unusual. People will work in London, but they'll live outside of the city where it's cheaper in a more rural place. But in Shakespeare's time, that commute, what I mean by commute is how long it takes Shakespeare to get from Stratford to London, would have been 2 or 3 days because he would have to go in a horse and carriage. Obviously, there weren't cars in that time, so it would take a long time. So I think this shows Shakespeare's dedication to his family life in Stratford upon Avon, as well as his career in London. And next we have a picture of Shakespeare's 3 children and their little dog as well. So the kids, Susanna, Hamnet, the boy in the middle, and Judith. Okay, so speaking of Shakespeare's career, we're going to move on to talking about that next. So his career in London. So there's not a lot of evidence about the very start of Shakespeare's career. This is one thing that is often difficult when we're wanting to find out about people from history because, people didn't have mobile phones, they didn't have laptops, social media. There isn't an online record of everything they were doing. We have to look for things in paper or things in the ground even, like things from their house that were buried. It's much more difficult to find out information about people. Or another way we can find information is talking to people who lived at the same time as them. So we have to piece together the story of their lives from lots of different places. And for this reason, there is a time of Shakespeare's life that we don't really know too much about what he was doing. So, for example, we know his twins, so Hamnet and Judith. We know that they were baptized in 1585. We also know that by 1592, Shakespeare's reputation as an actor and a playwright was pretty well established. So in these 7 years, we don't really know exactly what Shakespeare did, but somehow he went from having and baptizing his twins to being an established playwright and actor in 7 years and in London as well. So scholars, so what I was talking about before, people who research academic things, refer to these years as the lost years because we don't know what Shakespeare was doing at that time. Despite only being active as a writer for about 25 years, Shakespeare wrote lots and lots of things. He wrote a wide range of materials as well, so not just the same thing. Like I said before, he wrote sonnets and plays. So a sonnet is a type of poem. So he was a poet and a playwright. So overall, there were 3 different aspects to his career. The first aspect is as an actor, as well as writing plays, which is what Shakespeare is most well known for being a writer. He liked acting in them as well. Shakespeare was a founding member of a group of actors called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. With this group, he produced on average 2 plays a year for almost 20 years. So he did a lot of work with this group of actors and they were very well known. There were some other well-known figures from society in the group as well. And he stayed with this company for his whole career as well. He didn't change, so they will have been good friends, they will have socialized together, as well as working together on putting on plays. So they started off being called Lord Chamberlain's men, and then actually later on they changed and they became the King's men because they were so important and they were so popular that King James I heard of them. And he liked them so much that he wanted to support them. So King James I gave this group of actors money so that they could keep putting on shows. And the deal was that then they become called the King's Men. And it was actually during this time when King James I was supporting Shakespeare's group of actors that he wrote some of his most well-known tragedies, for example, Macbeth and King Lear. So it was a time when, especially because he was getting money to help pay for all of this, Shakespeare was able to write some fantastic work. And as I mentioned before, during his life, Shakespeare acted before both Queen Elizabeth I, so not the current Queen Elizabeth we have, the first Queen Elizabeth that was alive when Shakespeare was alive, and King James I. So I hope you can see from that because he's performing in front of the Queen and the King, and sometimes performing his own plays that he wrote, he was very well established in society and considered very important. So the next thing we have that shaped the next part of his career, so the first part is being an actor, the second part is being a poet. And Shakespeare he's very famous for a particular type of poem called a sonnet. Here is an example of a sonnet. I'm going to show you, but please don't be scared by it because I know that you know English, but you might not be able to read this because it's in Old English. So it is different to modern English, but let's have a look anyway. So here it is, Sonnet 130. So the sonnets don't have names, they just have numbers. Sonnet 1, Sonnet 2, Sonnet 3, Sonnet 130. Shakespeare published, as I said, 154 sonnets. So he wrote so many, and they all have the same structure. So they all have 14 lines and the same rhyming pattern. By rhyming pattern, I mean sun rhymes with done, red with head. So each line rhymes the same way in all of the sonnets. And they cover a lot of themes about human life, which make them still relevant today, mean people still read them today. For example, they're often about love. This poem is about love, and they're often about mortality. So by that, I mean people dying. It's themes that, as I was saying at the start, even though they were written 400 years ago, these things still play a part in our life today. So we still can read them and find them interesting. So yeah, as you can see, the language here is a little bit strange. Like you can see this a word at the end of the first line, sun, is actually the word that we all know, sun in the sky, S-U-N, but it's spelt differently. And there's lots of other things in the poem where they aren't quite said or spelt the same as they are today. And so lots of his sonnets are translated into modern English. They can still be a little bit difficult to understand, as a lot of poetry is. It can take time to understand. But once you do, they are really some of the best poems in the world. And like I said, they can be funny, entertaining, sad, relatable, all these things that make Shakespeare's work still relevant today. So as well as the sonnets, he wrote a couple of narrative poems. So that's poems that tell a story, and a variety of other poems as well. So now we're coming on to the third part of his career, and probably the part of his career that he's most famous for. This is being a playwright. So a playwright is someone who writes plays. Shakespeare wrote 3 different types of plays. All in all, he wrote 38. So there's lots and lots. Actually, we think that there are more. We know that there are at least 2 more. Unfortunately, over the years, they've been lost. So we don't know what they said, what Shakespeare wrote. So it's a real shame we've missed out on some other great Shakespeare works that we could have explored, read, enjoyed, watched at the theatre today. So as I said, there's at least 2 more that got lost. We think there are more that will have been lost too. But of the plays we have 38. So the three different categories of plays. First, we have comedies. They're ones that are funny, they have a happy ending. It often involves people falling in and out of love with different people, falling in love with someone who's maybe the girlfriend of someone else, things going wrong, but all in a very funny way. An example would be A Midsummer Night's Dream. In this play, it's very funny. Even someone's head turns into the head of a donkey. So some crazy stuff happens, and they're very funny. The next type is tragedies. These, obviously, as tragedy implies, have a sad ending. Normally, there's some humour at the start. They can be a little bit funny, some happy things happen, but things go badly wrong and they have a sad ending. These are plays like Macbeth, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet. So it would have left audiences sad at the end of the play, but they've watched a great piece of art. Sometimes we like to watch things which make us sad because it just makes us feel emotion, and it's good to feel that sometimes. The third type of play are histories. These are about real stories that were happening at the time that Shakespeare was alive, or maybe a little bit before, and Shakespeare would tell them in a very dramatic way to try and make the stories sound more glorious, more glamorous. It's a way, almost a way of propaganda at the time, so of trying to show how great England is and for people to watch it and think, wow, I'm so proud to be from England, it's a great country. So here we have the three different types. So we've got the tragedies, of which there were 10, as it says, serious themes, often death, and yeah, quite dark. The histories, with real figures from England's history, and Shakespeare would embellish the plot. So embellish means make it better, make it more exciting. And then finally we have the comedies. These use comedic language, so they're funny, plot twists, mistaken identity, so that's like someone pretending to be someone else in disguise, or being maybe I think you're someone else and you're not, and it creates lots and lots of confusion, and they're very funny to watch. And here we have a Shakespeare bookshelf. So we've got the comedies at the top, the tragedies in the middle, and the histories at the bottom. So you can see we've got some plays in multiple parts as well. So Henry VI had 3 parts, and one part could be about 3 hours long. So these weren't short shows you'd be going and watching for about 3 hours. So we also know, as well as all of these plays that Shakespeare wrote that we found, there's the ones that he's lost, and there's others that he worked on with other playwrights. So some they co-wrote, so they wrote together. For example, with Shakespeare's friend Christopher Marlowe, who's another famous English writer from the time. So yeah, they worked on these things together. So all in all, he's an actor. He wrote lots of poems, and he did lots of plays himself, more that we don't know about, and plays with other people. So Shakespeare must have been a very, very busy man, bearing in mind that at the same time as doing all of this, he was travelling backwards and forwards from Stratford to see his family, his children, his wife, back to London for his career. So he must have been very busy. And, you know, he didn't live the longest life. He died when he was only 52. For the time, that was quite a long life. People didn't live as long as they do now, but still, it's a lot to pack in to not a very long life. Okay, next, we're going to talk about the Globe Theatre. This is where Shakespeare's plays were performed. The first theatre in London opened in 1576. This was when Shakespeare was first starting out in London as an actor and writing plays. And then the Globe Theatre was built in 1599. And this was funded by Shakespeare and some other people that he worked with. And it's where the King's Men, Shakespeare and his group of actors, performed all of their plays for lots and lots of time. And Also, I wanted to show you where it is. So this is London theatres in the 17th century, around 1600. And we can see the Globe is right down here at the bottom, near Southwark, near London Bridge. But it was right on the bank of the River Thames, so very central. Lots of people would go and go to this play because it's easy to get to. And what we can also see, this is how it looks inside. You have the stage in the middle, the bit at the bottom, and then the bits around the top as well. The bit at the bottom was called the pit, and that was cheaper tickets. So where poorer people could go, they could go and see one of these plays for just a penny. And people here were called the groundlings. It's a bit rude, and then also in summertime, the groundlings were referred to as the stinkards because people didn't shower as much back then, so it could be a little bit smelly and sweaty down there in summer as well. But as you can see, because it was so cheap, there was lots of space, Shakespeare made his plays accessible to the whole public, so not only the rich and famous people. But then we have, for the richer and more famous people, the bit around the sides, the boxes, which you would pay more money for so that you actually get a seat, you're not just standing, you get a better view. A bit like the theatre today, you have stalls at the bottom and more expensive seats around the top. Overall, the Globe could hold 3,000 people, and it was open at the top. So at the top, there's no roof, so you have to hope for good weather. The way that they would tell everyone what play was going on, because not everyone could read in these times, so they had a system of flags outside the theatre. If it was a red flag that day, it was a history play, a white one for a comedy, and a black one for a tragedy. So you could walk past, you could look at the flag without reading and think, oh, it's a comedy today, I want to see a comedy, pay your penny and go and watch the show. One time, the Globe Theatre actually burnt down. So they had lots of props in the theatre and they even had some fake cannons. And once a cannon, like a type of gun, misfired and set the thatched roof, the roof that you have on the top made of straw, on fire, and the whole building burnt down. According to one of the survivors, no one was actually hurt, everyone escaped. One man's trousers were set on fire, but he managed to put them out with a bottle of beer, so I think everyone was okay in the end. Because the theatre had been so successful, after it was burnt down, it was rebuilt the next year, so they didn't have to wait too much longer to get back up and running. In 1614, it was rebuilt. Shakespeare, as we already know, died just 2 years later in 1616, but the Globe Theatre continued to put plays on even after he died. It was very famous. The Globe Theatre closed later that century, but it's been reopened. They've made a reconstruction of the Globe Theatre in 1997, and it's in London, and you can still visit it today. So you can go to the Globe Theatre just like it used to be and watch a Shakespeare play just like they used to. You can even stand in the pit or you can pay extra for a seat. It's very exciting. If you're ever in London, I would recommend going and seeing a show at the Globe. Another thing we should note about the Globe is that there were only male actors. Even if the part was a female, it would be played by a young boy with a high voice instead, because theatre was considered too risque, too naughty for ladies. It wasn't something that ladies at the time were allowed to do. So yeah, even when you saw a female character, it was a man in a dress, which seems funny to us now, but at the time that was normal. So I just wanted to talk about overall, to finish, Shakespeare's success. So how is he so successful today? Today, Shakespeare is the second most quoted English writer all over the world. I don't know if anyone can guess what the first is. The only thing that's beaten Shakespeare is the Bible. So the Bible is the only English work more quoted than Shakespeare. And there's been studies that show Shakespeare wrote nearly a tenth of the most quoted lines ever written or spoken in English. So he is really all over the world. People know his work all over, How can one man have so much success? Well, actually, he was a really good businessman as well. So, whilst acting, writing, being a dad and a family man, he became very rich and famous because he invested in property. He earned money for the plays he wrote, as well as taking a share from the theatre's profits. So, he really became quite wealthy, and he's so successful today because, as we've said, the things he spoke about are still relatable today. Love, friendship, death, all these things are still relevant to our lives. And also, Shakespeare invented a lot of words that we still use today in English. He introduced 3,000 words to the English language. This picture of Shakespeare shows you some of them. So let's have a look. Words like gossip, like when you're talking about someone whilst you're not there, you're gossiping about them. He invented that. Eyeball, the thing in your eye, he even invented that. Somewhere on here I know there's bedroom. He invented the word bedroom, or downstairs. And some of these words, it's difficult to think how we would say what we want to say without them. So he really has helped along the English language and thought up lots of phrases and words that we still use today. It's estimated that Shakespeare's vocabulary was between 17,000 and 29,000 words. That means in Shakespeare's head, he knew up to 29,000 words, and that's more than double the average person even today. So he's a very, very clever man. As his very last act, Shakespeare put a curse on his grave when he died. He said, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." So at the time, it was customary, it was normal to dig up bones from previous graves and move them to make space for other people. But even today, because Shakespeare put this curse on his grave, people were too scared to dig them up. So his body is still in the same place today. You can still go and see it, and you can still see Shakespeare's original curse that he put on there. So if you're ever in England, go and have a look around Stratford, go and have a look around London to the Globe, and if you're very lucky, go and see a Shakespeare show, and I'm sure you will enjoy it. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you've learned lots about Shakespeare. I really enjoyed making this. I love Shakespeare and his works. Maybe in future I could do a video about one of his plays, so Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth. If you ever study in a British school or in England, Shakespeare will definitely be spoken about. It's a good thing to have an idea of the plot of some of his plays, but it's an even better thing to enjoy it in full, hear the Old English, maybe not understand it all, but still enjoy figuring out what he's saying, looking at all the characters' problems, and how Shakespeare has fun with creating drama that we still enjoy today. So thank you very much, guys, and hopefully I will see you for one of my next videos. Bye.